Good afternoon. And we're here for the final push. So we have one more talk, and then we'll have our panel discussion. So I'd like to introduce Matt Mayernik. He's from NCAR UCAR Libraries. And Matt did his education in the Golden State, BS at Caltech in engineering, and then did his postgraduate work at UCLA, Master's of Science in Library Science, and PhD in Information Science and Systems. So he's come up here for the oxygen. The thick air was getting a little bit too much for him, I guess, and for the last several years he's been here in Boulder. And also Matt gave a presentation 3 years ago at a similarly themed workshop, our previous Unidata Users Workshop, and especially looking forward to maybe hearing some perspective from Matt how things have changed, and maybe certainly some issues that continue to remain. So let's welcome Matt Mayernik.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. And thanks to Unidata for the opportunity to talk again in front of the workshop. I'm looking forward to the discussion and being part of the last push, to borrow Kevin's football metaphor. Hopefully I don't fumble at the 5-yard line, right? Okay, so I guess I can move over here. So as Kevin said, I'm here at NCAR in the NCAR library as a project scientist and research data services specialist. So I lead NCAR, the NCAR library's participation in data initiatives, whether that's within NCAR or externally. And so this issue of data and software citation, which I'm going to be talking about today, has been one of our main projects. And we've had a good working group at NCAR, which I'll talk briefly about, as well as some external stuff. So as Kevin mentioned, I did give a talk at the last users workshop. This was my title slide. Just out of curiosity, how many of you were here for that? All right, a small number. So as you can see, even sort of my title, I think, indicates kind of where the state of the art was at the time. A bit confused. Kind of everything was just getting started in terms of this issue. It was really the stage of where we were sort of figuring out the questions, what were the key issues, the concepts, and sort of in the very much the pilot stage. And so 3 years down the road, I think we as both NCAR and as the sort of geoscience community have made a lot of progress. There's been a lot of developments in some of these issues, which I'm going to try to talk about. So this is the general outline. So I will recap a little bit some of the kind of basic ideas behind this issue of data and software citation, just to kind of make sure everyone's up to speed. And then I'll talk about, especially in the past, say, 3 years, some of the recent initiatives, tools, and things that are coming up. I'm going to spend some time talking about journal policies, which we may not be too excited about, but I think it's really going to be core to this issue. And then some tools and services. Before we get into the discussion, I'm going to turn over to Ethan, who's going to give a brief update of Unidata activity in this area, which I think will be useful. And hopefully that can kick us off into some discussion. And I'll give a brief demo of one of the tools that I'll mention. Oops, sorry, I just gave away my joke. So when you talk about citations, the first thing that comes to mind often is counts, right? You count things, big lists, top cited, top this, top that. So in preparing for this talk and looking at other work recently, I was looking at the bulletin of the AMS for the top cited. What are the top cited papers in the bulletin of AMS? And I was going to ask you if anybody had any ideas of what that was, but I gave it away. The top cited one in the history of the AMS, by about a factor of 4, actually, according to the Web of Science, is this paper, the NCEP NCAR reanalysis. According to the Web of Science, over 12,000 citations. If you look at Google Scholar, it would be much higher than that because they count differently. And as I said, about a factor of 4 higher than the next highest. So why has this paper been cited so many times? Because people use the data, right? Everyone uses this data set. And it's not only was published in '96, it's continually updated to this day. So if you look at this abstract, look at it, you see this little thing down here, which you may not be able to read, so I'll pull it up. This is a URL where you should be able to find the data output. Any guesses on whether this URL still works? Any guesses on whether this URL ever worked? there's actually a colon that's in the wrong place. That's a separate issue. Even if you were to put the colon in the right place, obviously this URL does not work anymore. So this is 1996. This data set's not too hard to find if you want to find it using Google or other tools. Here's another example. This was, I think, according to the Web of Science when I looked the other day, number 10 on BAMS in terms of most cited. Software package OPAC. I'm not familiar with it, but I'm guessing many of you are. Again, somewhere down in the paper, a software package is freely available World Wide Web, and he guesses as to whether this URL still exists. This is papers from 1998, by the way. So again, of course, the answer is no. This URL is down. If you Google the OPAC, you can find it online. It's actually now in France, not Germany. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But again, it's not there. So you might be saying, well, it's late 90s. No one really knew how the internet worked in the late 90s. That's fair enough. So let's go to the most recent addition to the top 10 list, which is from 2012, CMIT 5. Some of you might work in that area. If you dig down into this paper, there's this statement. Once registered, a user can access CMIT 5 model output through the PCM data portal, this URL, or through any of the ESG federated gateways. Well, any guesses again? This link, at least for me, took me to a dead link. So I think I'm not trying to point fingers at anybody or any of the authors of these papers. I think the point is hopefully pretty clear that relying on URLs to provide provide consistent access to resources of any kind over time may not be something we can rely on, whether it's older or newer. Now, to be fair, all of these resources you could find online probably without too much difficulty. But these are also very high visibility, probably there's a good deal of resources behind them, and very widely used. So if they were just to disappear, it'd be obviously a big issue. But if you think about the full sort of literature range of how many papers have been produced that provide links to data sets, software, and so on, you can sort of get an idea of the scale of the issue. So these are the citations for those papers, just for completeness. Since I talk about citations, I always need to cover myself with that. But also, I think, to sort of make the next point, which is if I give you these citations, you can probably find these resources, right? You can look up the titles, you can look up the authors. We know that the bulletin of the AMS, where we can find that. We know it's around. We know it's been around for 100 years or so, maybe not that long, but a good long time. And then DOIs, we're pretty familiar with those at this point, hopefully, at least in regards to literature. I will talk about them more a little bit later. So this is when we're talking about data and software citation, at a very simplistic perspective, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to move towards something like this. A citation to a data set that essentially serves the same function as the citations to the papers that I just showed. It has the same sort of functions of location, identity, and integrity, I guess, longevity. So some of the same things. This is a real citation from a data set archived here at NCAR. And again, there's the DOI, which I mentioned. I'll talk a bit more about. So this is the bigger picture. I think the sort of simplistic motivation is pretty obvious. We want links to not go away. But I think there's a lot of more interest in this that goes beyond just sort of link rot, and that's both sort of the integrity of science and the integrity of the research being done, as well as issues of how do we understand who's been using my data if I've created a data set. So data centers are very interested in the idea of data citations because they often have trouble understanding who did create their data set or use their data set, and what they've been used for. Right? Download counts are great, but they don't tell you the full picture of whether somebody actually used something. And so citations hopefully give you a better picture of that. For somebody who's creating a data set, you hopefully, again, can get a clear understanding of who may have used that and for what purposes. Getting professional credit, I think, is a big motivation here. That's a big step from where we are now, but hopefully we're taking steps in that direction. And then for users, hopefully the sort of idea of data citations will help you find data easier. If you read a paper, you don't have to dig through all the URLs, do Google searches because something doesn't work. There'll be a mechanism where you can fairly easily get to the data set you're looking at. So this is one example from NCAR. This was actually the first DOI we signed a couple years ago. The NARCAP data set, which is a regional modeling kind of composite data set. So we assigned a DOI to this. The ways DOIs work is that's sort of the URL, just in case you aren't familiar with these. And that it's sort of a big redirect system. You can think of it in that way, sort of internationally established redirect URL system. So it'll point you to where the current location is, which is this Earth System Grid website. You probably can't really see that, but right there is the citation to this resource that those scientists who are a part of this project have put together, and right there on the front page. And that's just so you can actually see it. It's an RCAP data set. NCL, NCAR Commandment Language, some of you may use that, is another, was I think the second DOI we assigned. First to a software package. And again, they put together a citation for it. They have put it on their website and are promoting it. I'll come back to a few metrics on these a little bit later in terms of how they're being used. So I think at this time 3 years ago, this was how many DOIs we had signed, 2. So we were very much in the pilot stage. At NCAR, these are sort of current numbers. We're now over 1,000 in terms of total, over 500 in terms of data sets, and sort of a smattering of other things, which I can talk about. The NCAR library, we're also using it for the NCAR Technical Report series, if you're familiar with that series, which is the text there. The NCAR Earth Observing Laboratory has assigned DOIs to a number of their observational facilities, which is the physical objects. So the airplane, they're trying to see if the traceability will follow through from those as well. There's kind of a standard suite of tools that are starting to be used for organizations who are assigning DOIs, and that's kind of the Datasite Easy ID. Details of those aren't too important for this talk, but I can talk about sort of how you get DOIs if you want to talk about that. And this is certainly not just an NCAR thing. I think we're seeing this at many data facilities around the world, really. So here's one from NOAA. They have a citation right there on this page. This is just sort of random example. The CMIP itself, the CMIP project, has sort of realized this issue, and they've got DOIs for many of their data sets. So you can see it's being done in a little bit different ways at different places, but the same idea of assigning unique identifiers so we can promote these resources as citable objects. And that sort of leads into this idea of principles. And this, I think, is one of the maybe outcomes of the last couple of years is with all this interest in different working groups. There's been a number of meetings to try to determine consensus. Well, what does it mean to cite a data set, and how do you actually do that? And so there's this list, I think, which is the sort of most consensus of all the consensus principles. A number of working groups from different sub-communities came together to put these together. And each one of them has sort of a statement if you were to go to the URL. And I think this PowerPoint is in the folder, so there's many links in here. Feel free to follow those. So I just put the first snippet for the importance principle, but the idea the data should be considered as legitimate, citable products of research. And then there's a number of other principles there. So this has so far been endorsed by about 90 organizations, journals, data repositories, 37 as I showed there, from lots of different disciplines and domains. Another, I think, important initiative in the Earth Sciences is this Coalition for Publishing Data in the Earth and Space Sciences, which is a terrible acronym, but they went with it anyway. This was a group that was convened, I think, last year by the AGU and some of the data facilities to put together as the name suggests, a coalition of publishers and data facilities to try to come to try to increase the coordination among the inputs and the outputs of science. So this is one of the sort of pieces in that statement that they put together, a statement of commitment. Provide an organizational framework for Earth and space science publishers and data facilities to jointly implement and promote common policies and procedures for the publication and citation of data across Earth science journals. So you can see it's very much sort of supporting and promoting this idea of data citation. It's 37 signatories, including the American Meteorological Society and I assume AGU. I didn't check for that, but I'm sure they're on there. And then there's the URL. There's not a whole lot that they've produced yet besides this statement, but they're trying to, I think, still get themselves on their feet in terms of what they're going to achieve next. Some tools are starting to come out. The Data Citation Index, this is a Thomson Reuters product. If you use the Web of Science citation indexes, this is essentially another module therein. It started a couple years ago. It's part of the Web of Science, so it is a subscription service. So you wouldn't have access to it unless your library subscribed to it. It's quite expensive, which all Thomson Reuters products are. It's still in the early stages. So I think at this point, it's kind of a pilot system itself. The only actual libraries who I know of who've subscribed to it are large research libraries with big budgets. So NCAR not being in either of those categories, we've not subscribed to it ourselves, but it's possible that your library might have that. And so what they're trying to build is a citation index with lists of data sets and citations, just like they've done for the literature. But again, I think it's in the early stages, and it's not, the value is still unclear at this point. Datasite search. So I mentioned Datasite was one of the services that a lot of organizations are using to get DOIs for their resources. And I'll do a brief demo, which sort of I was motivated to do after David Duleen's talk this morning, of what you can do with this. But this is basically a big listing of all of the DOIs that have been, resources that have been assigned DOIs through Datasite. And so there's over, I think, 5 or 10 million at this point. And I'll briefly do a demo of this just to kind of give you an idea a little later. So now I think I'm going to turn to the question of, so assigning DOIs, that's one thing. Are people actually using them is another. Or to sort of ask the question alternately, how currently do people cite software data sets? So this is a paper, and it may not be super legible, a figure from an in-press paper, I should say, from an information science journal by some folks at the University of Texas. And their question was, in the biological literature, how have people referenced software? So if people mention software in their papers, how do they do that? So they took a sample, a random sample of about 100 papers. They looked at them all in depth. They found, I think, 59, it says here, actual papers that mentioned software, and then they looked at how they did that. And the three categories that they sort of clumped these into is citing to the publication. So it's kind of what I showed earlier, like the OPAC example. So citing a paper that presented a software package. Citing like an instrument, which I think in their terminology was, we used the XX software and give a URL. So it's kind of like we used an X instrument and gave a URL. And then informal is even less formal than that. So maybe just mentioning it, putting in a URL without any details. And so for the most part, all of these are pretty low. None of them are really formal. And I think this is a good illustration of sort of, right now, the sort of ways that we currently reference, particularly software and data, are very variable. And the idea of data citations, of course, is to try to bring some uniformity to that. So this is one example. We started doing some evaluation of our own DOIs at NCAR. And this is kind of a difficult process because it tends to require manual work. But we had one small project to look at this. Are people actually referencing? So we were assigning these DOIs and how they're doing that. And then is this changing over time? So I have a couple of charts here from the first two examples that I gave, NARCAP and NCL. Part of the challenge with this evaluation is also because of the publication lag. We're looking at citations, which are part of the publication system. You may have created a DOI last year and nobody has cited it because very few papers, even if they've used them, have gone through because there's just a natural lag in the publication system. So these two are kind of our first good examples because we assigned these in 2012. So what you're seeing here is a couple charts, NARCAP and NCL. In the blue line is references that did not use the DOIs in both cases. And these references might be formal citations. They might be mentions in text. They might be mentions in acknowledgments, in the abstract. It could be anywhere in the paper. So I looked at all these papers individually to see where and how they referenced NARCAP. So it might have just been somewhere in the text, we use NARCAP data from X website. That would be in the blue line in this case. And then red is with actually using the DOI. And again, that may have been in the acknowledgments, it may have been in the references, it may have been in the text. I'm not going to look at that for this chart. But just sort of over time, do people reference this and how do they do it? So with the NARCAP example, you're seeing kind of in some sense what we would like to see, which is that at some point the red would overtake the blue and more people would be citing the resource using the DOI that we've assigned than not. The ID was assigned in 2012, and I think actually the NARCAP project has started really promoting within their community citations to this before we even assigned the DOIs, which I think that's the big bump in 2012 that's blue. And then you see, again, like I said, we would want these to cross over. So hopefully in 2015 we'll see more citations with the DOI than without. And of course this does not capture, I tried to be very thorough with this, looking for NARCAP data, various permutations. I used Google Scholar to find these articles, but there may have been things that I missed because they didn't make it clear at all that they used NARCAP data, at least in the way that the search engines could find. NCL, there's a little bit different story. Again, the DOI was assigned in 2012, and there's quite a dramatic upswing, which again we think is a good sign. The absolute numbers on NCL are higher. You don't want to take that to mean anything beyond that just NCL is a widely used tool. But what you see is with and without using the DOI kind of track each other. So it's not that there's any trend there in terms of whether the DOI is kind of pushing over. Maybe a little bit, and so again, we'll see if hopefully next year there's a clear indication of some trend towards more using of the DOI. I think both of these cases show the importance of community engagement. So assigning the identifier itself doesn't necessarily do a whole lot. Both of these groups have been very proactive in working with their communities. NCL, when they do tutorials, they always present the DOI and the citation and ask people to start citing it. They send emails to their mailing lists and so on. So there's kind of lots of factors here, but I think what we're seeing is there's not one size fits all, at least in these. I mean, it's two examples, obviously a very small case. You can't take statistical trends from that. But we're seeing some different patterns. So hopefully we can do some more analysis over time. A couple things I can say for sure is it's much easier to find these papers when they have the identifier in them than if they don't. The other thing I'll say is that there's kind of an unknown factor here of journal policies, because especially with these sort of new types of citations, journals may be stripping off identifiers if they don't like them. They may strip off all identifiers. Some journals still don't print DOIs, which is interesting. It's true. And so I think there's sort of an unknown category there. So I'm going to turn to journal policies now, and I think hopefully we can talk a little bit about this. Some of you may have seen some of these recent announcements. Both the AGU and AMS have recently put out new statements or policies in the AGU case about data citation or data related to their publications. And I'm going to talk more about these. The links are there. Both of them are fairly recent. I was part of the subcommittee, part of the AMS Board on Data Stewardship, who worked on this policy that I'll talk through, as well as Mohan. I'm not sure if he's still here right now, but he was part of that committee as well as the chair of the Board on Data Stewardship. So we put together a nice policy that I'll talk through. Of course, this is not just AGU and AMS. There's lots of these policies now starting to come out in journals. So, sort of, if there's one of the key points, hopefully you can take away from this is if you are publishing, be aware that there may be these requirements that you might be familiar with or you might not be familiar with, and they're probably a little bit different from case to case. So I'm going to look a little bit at these AGU and AMS policies to sort of talk through what they talk about. This is an editorial. You may have seen this put out in all of the AMS journals in the April issues of this year. This is just one from the Journal of Atmospheric Science, which I was a co-author along with Mohan and Bob Rauber from Illinois, kind of talking through this. Some of the details are there. So within the AMS, I think in some sense we kind of had the benefit of going second in this regard. We were able to look at the AGU policy and say what did we like, what did we think was a little bit confusing, as well as hearing reaction at various meetings to AGU's policy and what sort of people were giving feedback about. So the AMS one did sort of build on AGU, but it sort of differed in terms of how it ended up. So these are the kinds of things that I think are pretty similar across the two. So the first point is they both encourage authors to archive data in established data centers. Right? So if you go back to the first couple examples I showed, archiving on a personal website, while potentially useful in the short term, is not often a long-term solution. Usually it's not for obvious reasons, career-wise and so on. So that's, I think, a common point in both. So discouraging of archiving in personal servers. Doesn't mean you shouldn't put data up, but if you're sort of promoting it as a citable object, that's probably not the final solution. Yes, and so they both also note that if you're not curating data sets or you're not making them available, you should not be citing them formally. In the AMS recommendation, there is a statement of, if you can only put your data up somewhere locally, or you can't give it out for whatever reason, you could sort of cite it kind of like a personal communication. It's personal, unpublished data. It's not a great solution, but to indicate that you still have the data. And then limitations and restrictions. And there could be certainly legitimate ones. Should be reported to the editors, as you're going through the process. And it might be human subjects data. This might not be too relevant for this community, but privacy restrictions, those types of things. There's very valid reasons for not sharing data in some cases. Another issue here is, especially within the AMS, there's a lot of authors that are articled by international scientists and multinational in some projects. And different legal regimes may have different policies on what data can or cannot be made available in different countries. So that leads to one of the, I think, first differences between the two is that AGU is a policy. It sort of comes down as a mandate in terms of its language. The AMS is a recommendation because there is, when we were talking through the process, there was this sort of understanding that there may be reasons, valid reasons why people can't meet the requirement, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't promote it strongly. The data sets are archived and cited formally. AGUs is a bit more broad. There's a statement that's pretty sort of encompassing in terms of what it talks about as data. So it includes protocols, methods, software. The AMS statement is just focusing on data, which we can talk about as whether that's a plus or a minus, but that was a decision that was made as it was being written. AGU has a statement in there. Authors are expected to curate the above data, and this is, I think they're mostly talking about stuff that you're curating yourself, if you needed to do that or wanted to do that, for at least 5 years after publication. In the AMS, there's no time period sort of in this sense specified. And this was, again, kind of a conscious decision as we were writing this. Why is 5 years the right choice here? Why is it not 10? Why is it not 20? Why is it not 1? It was kind of unclear to us why there would be any specific time period. So the AMS statement, and I'm clearly showing my bias as to which one I think is better, but is a bit more focused on what's the goal. If the goal is scientific traceability, the sort of expectation is that you're supporting data in a way that encourages that goal. The AGU statement does talk about acknowledgements. It requires an explicit statement of an acknowledgement section that clarifies how users can access data. In the AMS, again, kind of taking off what we didn't think was very clear there, is acknowledgements are no longer considered the proper method of citation. So take out that ambiguity. Authors are advised to cite documents as outlined in the document. There's some examples which I'll show you what that might look like. AGU encourages the citation. We explicitly ask for citations in AMS. And then AGU does not provide examples. They link out to a couple of kind of community examples, whereas we provide some explicit examples, which these are a couple of them. So something like this. This is AMS Style. The format. I don't get too hung up on formats because each journal likes it a little bit differently, but this was the way it ended up in the AMS format. Authors, date, title, version, archive, so where it's, for instance, publisher, and then the access date, kind of a key point, especially for changing data sets, and then the DOI. The second one is very similar. We also went through and tried to come up with some examples that are a bit different. So, dynamic data sets, sort of versions or subsets. So in the first one, you can see kind of subset used is noted in there. And these kind of language here, it comes from ESIP, the Earth Science Information Partners, which has put together data citation recommendations. So we kind of tried to build on these community recommendations for these citation examples. So these are examples in the recommendation itself for AMS. Hopefully you can look at those and it makes sense, or if not, maybe we can talk through that even today. Updated daily, that's very common in a lot of work we do in the atmospheric sciences. Is an example there. This is also in the AMS recommendation. Just to go back to my original example, citing papers versus citing data. I think the point here is not to say don't cite the paper, but it's more that the paper doesn't do the job that we're trying to achieve, which is actually point people to the data set, get people to the data set. So this is the way it's worded. I think it ended up being worded pretty well. The general recommendation is to cite both of them because they accomplish different things. The paper links to the important but incomplete source of information, and the data citation links directly to the data sets and associated metadata. So the NCEP example I gave earlier, paper from 1996, it's still cited about 1,000 times per year. I think it's probably safe to say, I don't know the data set very well myself, but that there are things about it that are different than there were in 1996, right? So that's the idea, that just pointing to that paper, not only because the link is broken, but there's probably details that are different now than there were as described in that paper. So I'm going to sort of step back and turn then, well, this question of, this all sounds good, but what do I do? I've got data, where do I put it? I'm going to try to close up shortly on this presentation. So there's a couple of, I think, ways to sort of go about this. Starting point is AGU does have a list in their policy of suggested repositories, which I'll show a sort of snippet of here. It's mostly, if you can read, sort of federal facilities or data facilities, NCAR, NASA, NOAA. There's quite a few listed in here. I don't know quite how this list was put together, but I can say, looking at it, that you sort of need to dig into some of these, because I know, for example, the NCAR ones that are listed up there, NCAR Research Data Archive or the EOL archive, they don't take every data set. If you were to come with them with a biology data set, right, they wouldn't necessarily be equipped to take that. If you look closely, if you're sort of looking through all of these here, Unidata is listed there, which is interesting because as far as I was aware, Unidata is not a data repository. So however that got on there, that's on there. So I think this is a good starting point, this list, but take it with a grain of salt. The other thing I'll say is that the COPDES, the Coalition of Publishers and Data Facilities that I mentioned before, also has a task to kind of build a list like this. So I think they're going to start from here and hopefully do it a little bit better. University libraries is an option that might be available for some of you. Not all, in fact, most are probably not, but there are definitely universities that are starting to build data archiving systems and teams within their libraries and sort of within their campus as a whole. So there might be opportunities there. General purpose repositories, I wanted to point these out. Some of you might be familiar with these. Figshare is it's now part of the Macmillan Group, which is the company that publishes the Nature Journal. So kind of a commercial venture. Dataverse comes out of Harvard, and Dinoto, which is part of the CERN High Energy Physics organization in Switzerland, I think, or Europe in any case. And these are all sort of self-publication, if you want to call them that. They're sort of open systems. You can put stuff in. There's not sort of strong metadata requirements typically. It's essentially sort of, it's kind of file dropping, but with some sort of sustainability hopefully behind it. They all have sort of free services. Figshare definitely has kind of a cost sort of associated with it once you get into any type of reasonable size. I don't know if Dataverse does. I couldn't tell. Dinoto currently seemed to not have a sort of limitation on size, but there was sort of language that indicated that restriction might come. Let's see. So, and if you were looking closely at David Deline's talk earlier, you might have seen he had a DOI for Dinoto. This is a software package. Some of the materials that he talked about earlier in his talk. And I think, David, if I'm correct, that you were using sort of this service here. Dinoto has a GitHub integration, which they came out with last year, I think. And so the way this works is if you have your code in a GitHub repository, there's basically this service where it sort of essentially clones your current state of your repository, deposits it into Dinoto, assigns it a DOI, and it's sort of there. Right? They essentially tar it up, and it's there as a package. This guide is a pretty good guide as to how the process works. It's really not that complicated. And when I was digging into this a little bit, there's been about 3,000 software packages assigned DOIs through Dinoto, which I'm guessing most of them probably use this type of capability. Here's another example I was looking at before. This one has a kind of a preview, sort of shows what's in the repository. Not actually most of them that I saw didn't, but some of them did. This one also has a big link to the GitHub. I don't know how customizable that is. But again, for the most part, they're sort of zipped up or tarball packages. It seems like this is really being used for people who are wanting to archive software associated with a publication. So you've got a publication that's going in, you want to create sort of the version of that software as it was when your publication was completed, and then you may still be working on your GitHub repository, updating the code, but there's this sort of thing over here that's associated with your publication. It seems like that's kind of the main use. I don't see it being used at this point for community packages of software. IPython, we've talked about a lot about IPython, so I was just kind of curious. I was looking around their website. This is citing IPython, so this is how you would cite the IPython sort of product. And they suggest you cite their paper. I don't know, again, that's kind of the direction we're all talking about, but that's what they have on their website. I just thought that was interesting. So just to kind of close up here before we sort of jump into the next phase. So there's lots of activity. Hopefully you've gotten that idea. Many repositories, maybe even most in the earth sciences, are starting to assign DOIs. So if you use data from other repositories, be aware of that. Providing recommended citations. Many journals, and I wouldn't say most yet, but many journals are now requiring or asking, or strongly recommending archiving and citation, so be aware of those policies. And there are some tools that are emerging here. I think I was going to stop there. So before we jump into the discussion, I'll do a brief demo. I wanted to turn over to Ethan, who's right over here, for just a brief update for some Unidata information.
Hi. If I can figure this out, I may bring up a browser and just show you where we're at now. We just recently started working on creating DOIs for various software packages at Unidata, and really we did it a month or two ago. So we have 3 right now, one for NetCDF, one for IDV, and one for the Threads data server. And this is the Unidata homepage, and if you go to the Community tab here and down to Acknowledging Unidata, whoops, I clicked on the top part and not the pull down. Anyway, or something. I just wanted to point out where we have these. And we're trying to figure out kind of how to advertise these and how to encourage people to use them in their papers and whatnot to actually cite the software. If I can just make that a little bigger. So we have kind of some old style ways that we were, no, these have all been updated. So we have a lot of some suggestions here, and then down at the bottom here are the 3 DOIs we've actually created, minted, and so we're kind of new to this, and NCL is the one at NCAR that has had a lot of experience with that. We've looked at all the things they're doing and how they're listing things and how they're putting the metadata. So behind the DOIs, there's some metadata about the resource that you're minting the DOI for. We have individuals listed as authors, but we also want people to update the versions and the years for whichever one they're actually using when they cite it. If you cite a package, cite and include the version and date of when you use that data or what version you got. And some of the metadata behind there kind of changes, and that makes it a little odd, because we thought, oh, we'll make it really easy and have one DOI, and we won't have to worry about maintaining and updating the stuff all the time. So I'm not sure that was the right decision, and we may revisit that. But this is our current recommendation on how to cite it. And basically, I'd be interested in anybody any input anybody has about DOIs and how you think, what you think about citing software, and Unidata software in particular, and these DOIs. So I think that was, I just wanted to get this out there. This is kind of, we're just starting to advertise that these are available and encouraging people to use them. So this is kind of the kickoff of that. And so if you're citing, especially these 3, please use these DOIs. And again, it'll help. We're going to try to do some, we've done in the past, done some looking at references and citations for NetCDF and when they're used in papers. We're going to go back to some of those kind of surveys of that information after we get some experience with the DOIs and start trying to track that, as Matt was showing with some of the NCAR, the NCL, and some of the data sets. So there you have it, Unidata DOIs. Finally, we've only been working at it for, well, since soon after I saw that NCL had theirs, I was like, we should really do that. Well, now we have them, at least a few. So, thanks.
So any comments on that? Yeah.
So I'm a bit confused about process. So in your text, you say Unidata has minted digital object identifiers. Did you guys create those DOIs, or you went to a provider that created those and has a master list of those?
Yes, we worked through an interface of a provider. So
Okay.
UCAR has like a membership. NCAR has a membership or with EasyID, is that? EasyID, which works with Datasite and however that works, and goes all the way up to the DOI.
Okay.
So it all
So you make a
gets funneled up.
submission, a request, and they come back.
Exactly, right.
This
So
is what we're
we
gonna give
have
you.
the capabilities of sitting down and putting in information and minting, creating
I
a
see.
DOI for that resource.
Okay.
But it's through a mechanism that these
Provider.
other people provide, organizations provide, yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks.
I think this is going to come up later, but unlike papers, software changes. You know, when you publish a paper, it's kind of done, although that's changed a little bit too. But do you have any policy then to ever update these? Is it just that one software, one DOI, and that's all you're going to get, even if it changes significantly over 10, 20 years? Or what's the policy of refreshing the DOIs?
Well, for us, yes, these DOIs we're going to maintain them forever. But that is a good question. Can the GitHub, because all these software packages are actually on GitHub, so we could have gone that route to get DOIs. The way that works is for each version, each actual release, you get a DOI, or you can create a DOI. And we just thought, that seems like way too much work to have, every version or every minor version or major version, whatever, have a new DOI that we then have to maintain forever. So we thought, well, we'll do it this way and have one, and people will cite, put in the version and date that they access it and the version they're using. We will be updating the metadata, but that's an issue as different people come onto the team here at Unidata. Do we change the author list in the DOI metadata? How does that really work? So in some ways, we are experimenting. And the NCL for the NCAR command language did the same thing. They don't have a version number, I don't think.
They do have version numbers, but it's not associated with the DOI.
Yes, right. No, the software has version numbers, but the DOI is just one DOI for all version numbers. So it's kind of I think it's not clear yet what the best practice will become. Maybe Russ has a good answer for this.
No, I have
Oh, darn.
So first of all, good talk, Matt. This is really interesting. You mentioned
Mine, however, was
yours too. You're great. So Matt mentioned that why is Unidata in this list of repositories that AGU published? And I think the reason might be that AGU doesn't just say you want to cite data; it says protocols and software also. And Unidata is a center for software, and so I think they belong on that list of repositories for under AGU rules, not under AMS rules. But this was an AGU list. The second thing was in Ethan's talk, you give two different versions of the DOI here. One that just starts DOI : and the other which is an actual URL, http://. And it's my understanding that the second version is sort of the recommended way to cite DOIs now, so that there's always a platform, there's a landing page for every one of these that gives more information you can click on. But all the examples you gave use the first version of this. Is it now, in fact, recommended to use the HTTP version whenever you can?
That's a great question. I think in general, yes, the recommendation, and I think this is actually coming from the DOI organization themselves, is to use the URL version. And one technicality, they've now updated their system so you don't need the DX. You can just have doi.org/whatever. The examples that I gave, just go back to some of these. These are from the AMS sort of style guide, and so they made the decision, they being kind of the editorial team who manages the journal and the citation style guide. I think that's their practice they've been doing for a long time. So I think that's a good point. If you know about the URL syntax, this is not a big deal, but you're right. It's probably better. It would be better if they started using the URL syntax. So that might be something that sort of the kind of subcommittee can keep working on to see if they can update that. Yep. Sorry, Kevin, can you use the...
Maybe I'm missing something, but how do we avoid the problem that is shown in the AMS? Here we go. Sorry. How do we avoid the problem that we saw in the Calnet paper, where it's an explicit link to a dead URL? So I go there and it goes to Unidata. I could go to another DOI and it's pointing to GitHub or SourceForge. Well, we know how transient so many of these places. SourceForge was the cat's meow 5 years ago. Now it's kind of fading away. Everyone's going to GitHub. I mean, how do these get preserved? How do we end up that these just end up going to dead sites anyway?
Right, that's an important question. Part of the answer is I think this needs to be thought about not as purely a technical issue, but as a technical/institutional and policy issue. So the DOI, if I was to click on one of these, this takes you to the IDV page, right? So the idea for the DOI is Unidata at some point in the future, maybe they change their name to whatever, and the URL changes, but they still have the same package, is that they can, on their side, so this is not necessarily a technology thing, they can update the metadata that says this URL points to a different, this DOI through this syntax points to a different page. So the idea is if somebody cites this now, 10 years from now, even if the server name changes, the location of this changes, you still can find it through this sort of unique identifier. I mean, that's the point of the unique identifier. The bigger question of, what if Unidata, changes its name and doesn't update its URLs, right? That's not a problem that this technology is going to solve. So that's why in some sense, that's why the DOI system has some control over top of it. There's a little bit of money involved. It's generally fairly low depending on, what you're doing. I, as an individual, at least I don't think I can go in and say, I'd like some DOIs. Can I register to give myself some DOIs? Right? It's an organizational membership. The fact that there's some money involved, I think they sort of see as, it gives it a little bit of a, motivation to keep your sort of self invested in the system. It's not just you doing some things and forgetting about it because it didn't cost you anything. The sort of idea of promoting them as citable objects in the same sense as a paper also kind of ties the idea to the persistence of the publication system in the paper. If I give you those citations to the Calnet paper, in 30 years from now, chances are very, very good you'd still be able to find that paper. Right? There'd have to be a major disaster, and that would cause us many more problems to think about than just not being able to find a Calnet paper, right? For that thing probably to not be findable. And so I think that's the idea, is that since NCAR is an organization and other organizations are sort of buying into this, in some sense it's kind of an implicit commitment or explicit commitment that these are resources we think are valuable and that we would like to preserve. If NCAR gets defunded and we go away, hopefully there's some mechanism for those data sets to be transferred somewhere else. But that's kind of as much as we can control at this point. Hopefully that's a good answer.
Gretchen, did you have a? Okay.
Okay. Yeah, so let me do a brief demo. Thank you, Ethan. I was just going to show the Datasite search page, which I've been mentioning a few times. And yes, I'm going to use Internet Explorer. Please don't kick me out. Firefox occasionally gives me JavaScript problems. So Datasite, if you think of the DOI system as kind of a big tree. So there's the DOI foundation at the top, and then there are about 7 or a handful of registration services. Datasite is one of those. There's another one called Crossref, which is most journals work with. So most of your DOIs for your journals came through an organization called Crossref. There's a couple of others. I don't know all of them. I think one of them, there's like a big Hollywood sort of directory of films and things which use DOIs, which is a separate system. So Datasite is this service that was started about 2009, I think, as the name suggests, explicitly to address this issue of citing data and other things. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is when David Deline was talking earlier, he talked about some NASA data sets that he had helped create and was the PI on. and I forget exactly what you said, but you thought there was a DOI, you didn't know quite what it was. So I came to this system, and I just searched IFEX. Hopefully you can see this. Make it a little bit bigger. This might be a little bit too big. And it popped right up. There's a couple of them right here. IFEX, there's another one right here. There's a couple of other things down here. And so what this is, in some sense, this is a big registration of everything that has a DOI. So if you thought there something might be a DOI, and you weren't sure what it was, or you didn't know quite how to find it, this service might help you. This sort of clicking on any one of these will then give you some information. Ethan mentioned the metadata. This is sort of the metadata piece, kind of a simple example of that. There's David right there. And then here's the DOI. It's also linked right here. So if I can kind of click over here, goes through the DOI service, resolves, and then here's the actual data. You get data. This is what DOIs are supposed to let you do. It's a little bit of metadata, various things. There's some information down here about the DOI and so on. So it took me about, again, as I said, showed about 15 seconds to find that. It was very simple. So I kind of wanted just to point this out. This is one of the services that are sort of being built on top of this. In some sense, this could be a generic sort of search engine for data. It's not going to be comprehensive, but you could look for NASA data, 2,800 things. There's various filters over here, so you could say just give me data. You can look at different publishers. There's different sort of DAX here. So you can click on this one. So you can kind of filter your way down. And again, this is at the present, this is not going to be a full listing of all of the data sets because NCAR has more than 500 data sets. We haven't assigned DOIs to all of them. NASA hasn't. The NASA Goddard has more than 100 data sets that are shown here. So it's still incomplete, but over time, this is going to be more and more complete, I think. In addition to just the data, if I go back to David, search his name here. Oops, sorry, I got to clear these filters. Here's the software package we were just looking at in Dinoto. So it's anything that's been registered through Datasite, and this is probably the vast majority of data and software and sort of any other type of citations for sort of non-paper things that are in here. Just one other example, again, this could be thought of sort of as a generic thing. Aerosols, you talked about lots about aerosols. It's 2,000 documents in here. You can sort of do against, you can start filtering, 2,000 data sets. I know what these other things are. Probably is it more useful than Google for generic searching? Probably not at this point. But yeah, there's another one. I saw that as well. I'm not sure if that. I assumed that was you. So yeah, that's another NASA one, I think, or no, the Oak Ridge. So you never know what you'll find in here. So that was. I just wanted to kind of point this out in terms of thinking about citations and data sets. So if there was an issue, it could be yourself. You thought you had a DOI, but you weren't sure quite how to find it. This would be the way to do it for a data set or a software package. All right. That was all I was going to do. I do have a couple of other sort of things I could pull up as questions for discussion, but maybe I'll just leave it open to folks if there's anything else that.
So that's super loud. Okay. So you were saying like the Datasite, it's just data and software that's been registered with Datasite.
Yep.
And I feel like this is the area that I'm still kind of confused on, like the article DOIs, like, and I guess it took us a while to get there, but I feel pretty secure that if I go to one of the major search engines and I'm looking through things, that they're going to have all of the major articles on there. Like I don't have to worry about I'm missing something, yeah, or that somebody's going to miss me because it's not getting disseminated out there. So I wondered if you could talk about where do you think, what does the community need to do to make sure that we start to get to a point where there's a one source for making sure that we don't have like 10 different data sites,
right,
or whatever.
Right. So I think the short answer to your question is just since this is still fairly new in terms of the development of the overall approach, Datasite's only been around since 2009, and it ramped up, I'd say, fairly slowly. That I think that it's just things are getting backfilled. So NASA has how many thousands of data sets, and they're basically wanting to make sure they're doing it right. Kind of like Ethan said, typically with every sort of group that comes along and wants to get a DOI, so let's assign a couple, let's make sure we kind of get it right, let's make sure we start promoting it to our users right, and then let's backfill. So the Research Data Archive, which is one of our main archives here at NCAR, has 500 or 600 data sets. They've assigned, I think, 49 DOIs. And I don't know that they would assign DOIs to everything they have, but they've kind of been going on an almost one-by-one basis. Make sure their metadata is in order, make sure that the PI has been involved in the process, or at least notified, so that they're not sort of putting things with people's names out there when they're not aware of it. And just kind of working through their collection, similarly otherwise. So I think, if you sort of go back to this point about, some of these services, I would say probably a lot of the services on the AGU list are starting to assign DOIs. All of these sort of general purpose repositories are assigning DOIs. Most university libraries that are actually collecting data are sort of part of this movement as well. So I think it's as sort of more data gets sort of moved into this process, as the routine of I've got data, I'm going to deposit, right? I'm going to give it to somebody else, or I'm going to put it in a place where I know it's going to be sustained. The sort of filling in of the sort of citable data set will, I think, happen more and more consistently.
That helps a lot. That made me think of another question I had about DOIs.
Sure.
Is there, when you just look at a DOI, is there anything that says it's an article, or it's a data set, or it's a piece of software?
No, and that could be a whole talk itself. Kind of how much, essentially how much intelligence gets built into a DOI. I mean, if you know a lot, if you know things, what am I trying to say? So there are these numbers are sort of pseudo-random, I guess is what I want to say. They look random, but they aren't completely random. So this, for example, this means probably this means something. I don't know what this number means, but it means that there was a certain organization that did it. These are all random. If you look at some DOIs, there will be sort of more details sort of filled in here. You may have the journal sort of short name, and there's kind of different recommendations. Again, if you're promoting long-term preservation of something, the less intelligence you build into your identifier, the better, because details might change, so your identifier might get out of date. So I think the short answer is no, unfortunately.
So a follow-up question, real quick. I know we're running short on time, but does a user who's requesting a DOI have a certain amount of control as far as requesting? No, so I looked at a couple of different ones, and they have a longer path name with much more information. Does a user have any control of requesting what that might be? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, that's going to depend on where you're getting your DOI from.
Yeah.
Our NCAR recommendation, NCAR NUCAR, has been to use random for the kind of reason I mentioned before. Things might get out of date. I don't know the details, to be honest, for like a Figshare or Dinoto, whether you have control over that. They may just do it themselves. Or if you were to give your data to a NOAA archive and you could say, I want my DOI to say this, I don't know what their policy would be.
Okay.
I can say the NOAA is writing I forget their terms, like a strategic directive for their data centers, whatever the new name is, as to how they should be dealing with this. So that document would specify what level of control you would have for NOAA, for example. So it's going to vary based on where you're getting it from. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.